The great hall of Renfield stood cold despite the fire, and the Earl of Renfield held a yellowed map up to the tall window, so the light struck through it like a stain. His voice carried the length of the room, easy and pleased, the voice of a man performing to gentlemen who had already agreed to laugh. "Observe the hand," he said. "Observe how the ink runs here and here. This is the work of a certain family. The ink runs in her blood, gentlemen, and ink, as we have all learned to our cost, can be made to lie." He did not point at her. He did not need to. Every head at the long table turned, cups tilting, toward the woman in plain gray wool standing beside the document table with her hands folded before her. She was tall, chestnut hair pinned back without mercy, and she did not move. Only the small garnet ring on her right hand had been turned inward, the stone pressed into her palm, so that it looked to any careless eye as though she wore no ring at all. Adelaide Marchbank Della, to the 2 or 3 people left living who had loved her, kept her eyes on the map in his hand and said nothing. She knew that map. She knew the weight of the vellum, the particular yellow of 18 years aging, the waterline along its lower edge where it had once sat too near a damp wall. She knew, better than the Earl of Renfield would ever know anything, exactly where the lie in it lay and precisely who had put it there. But she had learned a great many things in 3 years of silence, and the first of them was this: a person who wishes to be underestimated must be very still. So she was still, and the gentlemen laughed into their cups, and the sound of it rolled down the hall and broke against her like a wave against a stone that has stood in the sea a long while and expects to stand a long while yet. The smell of the room was vellum and beeswax, old paper and older candle smoke, the particular perfume of a house that measured its worth in documents. She had been breathing it for 4 months now. She had come to Renfield Hall in the summer as a cataloguer of the estate's papers, a modest post, badly paid, the sort of work a gentlewoman fallen on hard times might take without quite dying of the shame of it. She sorted charters. She copied faded entries into fresh ledgers. She dusted the muniment room and mended the bindings of terriers and rentals older than the Earl's grandfather. It was quiet, patient, invisible work, and she had chosen it with the same care a surgeon chooses the place to set his knife. The Earl came away from the window and set the old survey down on the table with the flourish of a man laying a winning card. "The northern fields," he said to the company, tapping the parchment. 400 acres of the best pasture in the county, and once, would you credit it, claimed by a common cartographer. One Thomas Marchbank, a surveyor, a tradesman with a compass and a great opinion of himself. Edmund Harrow was 40 and wore it like an ornament, silver just beginning at his temples, broad through the shoulders, immaculate in dark blue with not a thread out of true. He was handsome in the hard, well-fed way of men who have never once in their lives been refused. When he smiled, which he did now, it did not reach the cold pale of his eyes. Marchbank surveyed these lands and swore the boundary ran here. His finger dragged along a line inked into the map. The Crown's examiners looked at his work and found it false, fraudulent, a boundary drawn to steal what was never his. The lands were declared forfeit and came, in the natural order of things, to Renfield, where they have prospered, as all things prosper here. A ripple of appreciative sound from the table. The man himself did not prosper. He died within the 12-month. Of shame, they say. I would not know. I have never had occasion to feel it. More laughter. Della watched a young gentleman near the fire wipe his mouth and grin, and she thought, without heat, that she would remember his face. And now, the Earl went on, Warming to it, the crown sends his daughter to keep my papers. There is a wit in the world after all. The forger's girl set to guard against forgery. He turned at last and looked at her directly, and his voice dropped into something almost gentle, which was worse. Tell me, Miss Marchbank, do you find the work instructive? Does it teach you the difference between an honest hand and a false one? Or is that a thing your family never learned? The hall waited. Somewhere the fire settled with a soft collapse of coals. I find the work instructive, my lord, Della said. Her voice was low and even, a voice that carried without being raised. One learns a great deal from old papers. They keep their secrets a long while, but they keep them. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. A servant's careful courtesy, agreement worn smooth. The Earl took it as such and turned away satisfied, and the gentlemen returned to their wine, and the moment passed over her head like weather. Only one man in the room heard the second thing folded quietly inside the first, and that was because he had spent 3 years listening for it. Julian Ashby stood near the cold end of the table with the estate's rent book open before him and had not turned a page in some minutes. He was 30, brown-haired, with an open, honest face that had never learned to hide what it felt, which was a great inconvenience to a man in the law. He was the Earl's steward now, his man of business, and he had watched this performance with his jaw set so hard the muscles stood out along it. When Della spoke, his eyes went to her, and something moved behind them. Grief, or shame, or the old thing that was both at once and had lived in him so long he no longer troubled to name it. He had known her before the ruin, when he was a clerk of 22 in her father's employ, and she was a girl of 19 with ink on her fingers and a laugh she gave freely. He had walked her home along the river on summer evenings and let himself imagine a future he had no right to. Then the survey was declared false, and Thomas Marchbank was broken in a season, and a young clerk who had seen something he should have spoken of had held his tongue for fear of his place, and had lost her far more surely than any spoken word could have cost him. He had not seen her again for years. And then in June she had walked into Renfield Hall in grey wool with her father's ring on her hand, and had looked at him once, and had said nothing at all, which was the most terrible thing she could have said. The Earl swept his company out toward the terrace and the promise of better wine, and the hall emptied of its laughter by degrees until only the two of them remained among the paper and the beeswax and the settling fire. Della crossed to the table and drew the old survey toward her without hurry. She bent over it, and then she did a thing her father had done 10,000 times, a thing so native to her that she was not aware she did it at all. She touched the tip of her tongue, very lightly, to a corner of the ink, tasting the age of it, the gall and iron of it, the way a shepherd tastes the wind. Then she lifted the map to the window and turned it until the light came clean through the vellum, and read the pale ghost of the watermark buried in the grain of the paper, the maker's mark, the year, the small honest facts a sheet of paper cannot lie about, however cleverly a hand may lie upon it. You should not let him hear that you understand it, Julian said quietly. The map. He thinks you dust the shelves. I do dust the shelves, Della said, not looking up. Della? Her name came out of him low and rough, as though it cost him. He means to be rid of you, before the feast. He told me this morning to have your wages made up and your things sent down to the village by week's end. He wants the forger's daughter gone from the house before the herald comes, and before the settlement is signed. He does not want the name Marchbank spoken anywhere near Lady Cassandra's people. He came a step closer, the rent book forgotten. I am telling you so that you might go before he can make a show of putting you out, so that you might keep at least that much. She set the map down and looked at him then, full, and her gray eyes were quiet and terribly steady. And why should you wish me to keep that much, Mr. Ashby? You had a chance once to spare a Marchbank a public shaming. I don't recall that you took it. The words were not cruel. That was the worst of them. There was no venom in her voice at all, only the plain recording of a fact, the way she might note a watermark or the date on a charter, and he took it full in the chest and had no answer, because there was none. I deserve that, he said at last. You deserve nothing from me either way. She turned back to her papers. It is not a debt. Debts can be paid. Then, more gently than he had any right to, because she was not made for cruelty however roused she might one day be, go and see to your master's terrace, Julian. He'll be wanting you. He stood a moment longer. There was a thing he carried, a thing he had carried so long it had grown into the shape of his ribs, and he opened his mouth as if he might at last set it down before her. And then the Earl's voice rang from the terrace calling for his steward, and the moment shut like a book, and Julian Ashby bowed his head and went. Della did not watch him go. She had a great deal of work to do, and very little time in which to do it, and she had long ago stopped spending herself on the men who had failed her father. She rolled the old survey and tied it and set it precisely where she had found it, so that no eye would know it had been touched. But she had touched it, and she had tasted the ink, and read the watermark, and she knew now with the cold certainty of arithmetic what she had suspected since the day she took this post, that the boundary line the Crown's examiners had called fraudulent was drawn in a different ink than the rest of the map, a younger ink, a later hand. Her father had surveyed true, and someone had redrawn his truth into a lie after he submitted it, and every acre of the northern fields and everything the Earl of Renfield had built upon them stood on that single stolen line. She knew something else besides, which the Earl did not, which not 6 people in the kingdom knew. A letter had come for her that morning, carried up by Mrs. Pole with a grumble about it having no proper direction. The housekeeper was 60 and gruff, and had a way of setting a cup of tea beside Della's elbow in the muniment room without a word, which was the nearest thing to kindness the house afforded. Foreign-looking seal on it, Mrs. Pole had said, dropping it on the table. Red wax. No crest I know. You keep queer correspondence, miss, for a girl who dusts books. And she had gone, and Della had waited until the door was shut before she broke the wax. The Earl, had he seen that seal, would not have known it. He knew the great seals, the arms of the county families, the marks of the London banks. He did not know this one, a small, plain circle of red wax with a device pressed into it that meant nothing to anyone who did not already know its meaning, and everything to the 2 people in England who did. The letter within was brief, and in a hand she knew as well as her own. Sir Reginald Pym, the King's Herald and Examiner of Titles, was coming to Renfield. He would arrive before the betrothal feast, to examine the estate's titles before the marriage settlement was signed, because Lady Cassandra Vane's family, cautious people and rich, whose money was the only thing keeping Renfield above water, required every acre proven clean and every grant proven sound before they would let their daughter and her fortune be joined to the Earl's name. And the Earl was not afraid. Why should he be? His papers were in beautiful order. Every charter, every grant, every conveyance that made Renfield great had been stamped and sealed and certified genuine by the keeper of the royal seal, that faceless crown officer, whoever the man was, whose authentication rendered a title beyond question. The Earl had never met the keeper. Few had. It was said to be some grey official in London who never left his ledgers. The Earl trusted the seal as he trusted the ground under his boots, and slept soundly, and mocked the cataloguer over his wine. Night came down over Renfield Hall. The company went to their beds or their cards, the fires banked, the candles pinched out one by one, until the great house lay dark and breathing. And in the muniment room, behind a door she had quietly locked, Adelaide Marchbank lit a single candle and went to work. She took down the estate's charters from their pigeonholes, the great founding grants of the house, and she laid them open on the table one by one. She was not reading the words. She had read the words. She bent over the seals, the discs of hardened wax that hung from the foot of each grant on their ribbons and cords, the marks that made each document law. She brought the candle close, and she tilted each seal to the light, and she found the thing she was looking for. Pressed into the wax of every grant that had made Renfield great, so small it could not be seen unless a person knew to look and knew precisely where, was a mark. A tiny device, no larger than a grain of wheat, set into the edge of the seal where the ribbon passed through. The private authentication of the keeper of the royal seal. The secret sign that only 2 living souls could read, and only 1 living soul could make. She had made them. Every one. For 3 years, from a plain gray life no one troubled to look at twice, she had held the legitimacy of this house and half the county in her ink and her wax, and no one had ever thought to ask the forger's daughter what she did with her evenings. She went through them all, patient, unhurried, the garnet ring turned inward against her palm and the candle burning low. The grant of the home farm, her mark. The old Parkland grant, her mark. The mill, the wood, the water meadows, her mark, her mark, her mark. And then, last, the grant of the northern fields, the 400 acres of stolen pasture, the very ground the Earl had held up to the light that morning to shame her family before his guests. She held it close to the flame and looked for her mark, and did not find it. Because she had never set it there. Because in 3 years, that one grant, the founding stone of everything the Earl of Renfield was, had never once passed the keeper's hand, and never would, because the boundary it rested on was a lie, and she was the one person in England appointed to know it. Adelaide Marchbank looked at that a long moment in the candlelight, her father's ring warm now against her palm where she had held it turned so long. Her face did not change. Down the hall a clock told the small hours into the dark, and the great house slept around her, certain of itself, certain of her, certain of everything. Then she gathered the charters and returned them to their pigeonholes, each precisely as she had found it, so that no eye would know they had been touched. She squared the edges, she smoothed the ribbons, and she leaned to the candle, and blew it out, and sat a moment in the dark, quite calm. The candle guttered and went dark, and for a moment the muniment room held nothing but the smell of cold wax and the faint animal warmth of the tallow still curling up from the wick. Della sat in that darkness longer than she needed to, her thumb moving over the small raised mark she had found pressed into the last charter, a mark no larger than a lentil, 3 fine lines crossing at an angle only she and one other living man knew how to read. Her own hand had made it. Not the plain gray cataloger's hand the Earl thought he had hired to sort his dusty boxes, but the hand the crown had appointed, 3 years past, to say what was true and what was false in every acre of this county. She let the memory come, because there was no one now to see her face soften with it. It had been raining the day Sir Reginald Pym first came to the narrow rooms above the stationer's where she had gone to live after they buried her father in the pauper's corner of the churchyard. No stone, only a wooden marker that the winter would rot. She had been mending a map for a shilling some merchant's coasting chart badly foxed when the King's Herald had climbed the stairs, portly and whiskered and dripping, and stood in her doorway looking not at her but at her hands, at the ink worked into the creases of her knuckles, at the way she held the pen. He had said, in a voice too gentle for so official a man, that he had known her father, that he had sat on the very board that declared Thomas Marchbank a forger, and that he had gone home that night and been unable to eat his supper, because the survey they condemned had been drawn by a man who could not lie in ink any more than he could lie aloud. He had brought a document with him that day. He laid it on her mending table, over the merchant's chart, and asked her to tell him what she saw. It was a land grant, she did not then know whose, and she had bent to it with the lens her father gave her on her 12th birthday, and she had told him. The vellum was genuine, the hand was a clerk's copperplate, the seal was the Great Seal right enough. And then she had turned it to the window and told him the thing he had come to hear, that the watermark in the lower corner, where the sheet had been made, did not match the date the grant claimed. The paper was younger than the words upon it, by 4 years at the least. Someone had written an old grant onto new paper. Sir Reginald had watched her the whole while, and when she finished he had sat down heavily on her one good chair and said that the office of Keeper of the Royal Seal had wanted filling these 2 years, for the last keeper had died and left the county's titles unverified, and 100 quiet frauds creeping in at the edges of every estate. The keeper worked unseen. The keeper's name appeared on nothing. The keeper set a mark into the wax of every grant she found honest, a mark of her own devising, known to the crown and to no one else, so that any title bearing it could be trusted, and any title lacking it could be questioned, and no great man could bully or bribe his way past a signature he could not even find. He had looked at her ink-stained fingers and said that he could think of no one in England better fitted to it, nor anyone the gentry would less suspect. A cartographer's disgraced daughter, plain and poor, who would ever look at her and see the one hand that held the truth of all their deeds? She had said yes before he finished asking, not for the pittance the office paid, though she had needed it, for her father, because every honest seal she pressed was a small, quiet argument against the lie they had made of him. For 3 years she had done it. The grants came to her by a hidden road, through Sir Reginald's clerk in plain wrappers, at odd hours, and she read each one as her father taught her, tongue-tipped to the ink to taste the gall, the sheet to the window to catch the watermark, the seal against the raking light of a low candle to find the little frauds that hid in the shine of the wax. Most she stamped, some she did not, and those men never knew why their titles were quietly held back for further examination, only that a door they expected to swing open had somehow stuck. She had stamped the deeds of men who, meeting her in the lane, would not have troubled to nod. She had held in her ink the legitimacy of the very people who spat her father's name across their dinner tables like a stone in the meat. And she had said nothing, and let them think her nothing, and waited, though she had not known, until she came to Renfield, what precisely she was waiting for. Now she knew. Now the little 3-lined mark under her thumb told her. She rose in the dark and felt her way to the shuttered window, and opened it a crack, and the autumn night came in cold and smelling of wet leaves and the far wood smoke of the village. Somewhere below a dog barked once and gave it up. She stood breathing it, letting the thing settle into its full and terrible shape, for she was a careful woman and would not act on a feeling before she had made it a fact. The founding grant of Renfield's greatness was the grant of the northern fields. Every acre the Earl had built his name upon, the enclosures, the new plantings, the rents that fattened him, the very solvency he now proposed to shore up with Lady Cassandra's fortune, all of it stood upon that one conveyance, dated the year her father's survey had been declared false. She had read that founding grant an hour ago by her single candle. It bore her own honest mark, pressed there 2 years back, before ever she came to this house, when it had crossed her hidden table as one grant among a season's many, and she had found the wax and the vellum sound, and had stamped it in good faith. That was the horror of it, and she made herself look at it squarely. She had authenticated the seal. The seal was genuine. The wax was true. The sheet was true. The hand was a proper clerk's. Everything about the document that could be tested from the document alone was honest, because the fraud had not been in the making of the grant. The fraud lay beneath it, in the survey the grant relied upon, the survey that fixed the boundary of the northern fields. If that boundary was false, if the line her father drew had been redrawn after his hand left it, then the grant conveyed land it had no right to convey, and no honest seal upon the paper could make honest the theft the paper described. She had stamped a truthful document that told a lie, and only she, of all the souls in England, both held the seal that vouched for it and knew enough to see the lie the seal could not reach. She needed the survey, the original as her father drew it, before the alteration. And she did not have it, and had never thought to have it, for it had gone into the Crown's own archive the day the board condemned it, and had not been seen since. She closed the shutter and went to her narrow bed, and did not sleep, and in the gray of the morning she went down as the humble cataloguer, and set about the Earl's dusty boxes as though nothing in the world had changed. The days that followed were a strange doubled thing. By the light she was Miss Marchbank, the sorter of papers, kneeling in the muniment room among the deed boxes, her sleeves pinned back, a smudge of dust always on one cheekbone. Mrs. Pole brought her bread and dripping at noon, and stood over her while she ate it, gruff, as though feeding a stray, and once said, "Lo, that it was a shame how his lordship carried on, and a body could see the girl was gentle raised, whatever her name, and then went off cross with herself for having said so much." Lady Cassandra came down twice, bright and kind, and altogether unknowing, to thank her for the library set to rights, for she did love a tidy shelf, and she had a way of touching Della's ink-stained hand quite without flinching, as no other lady in the house would do, and both times the Earl, hearing of it, had found some reason at dinner to remind the table what manner of blood the cataloguer carried, that his betrothed might not grow too familiar with a forger's get. Della had served at no table. She took her meals below, but the words came down to her through Mrs. Pole's tight mouth, and she folded them away with the rest. It was Julian who broke her open. He found her on the fourth evening at the long table under the north window, the old survey of the northern fields spread before her, not the original, which she could not have, but the estate's own certified copy, the one bound into Renfield's title books, the one every settlement referred to. She had it turned to the light and was bent so close her breath stirred the dust on it. And she did not hear him come in, and when she looked up he was standing quite still, 3 feet off, his honest face gone pale, as though he had seen something he had spent 10 years not looking at. "You read it the way he did," Julian said. "Your father. You hold your head just so." She said nothing. Her thumb was resting, she realized, on the boundary line, the long inked stroke that ran the northern edge of the fields, dividing what had been Marchbank land from what became Renfields. Julian shut the door behind him, softly, and came and stood across the table, and for a long moment he only looked at the map. Then he said, in the voice of a man setting down a weight he can no longer carry, "That line is wrong." She went very still. "I was a clerk," he said, 22. "I copied fair the surveys that came into the office, and I filed them, and I held my tongue, and I have held it since, and it has rotted in me every day of 10 years. His hands had begun to shake. He pressed them flat to the table to still them. "Your father's survey came in on a Tuesday. I copied it fair the Wednesday. I know the line he drew, Miss Marchbank. I drew it after him, with my own pen. 100 times over I have seen it since when I close my eyes. It ran here." He touched the map, a good hand's breadth south of the inked boundary, where the fields narrowed toward the beck. Here, along the old watercourse, the way the land itself falls. That was the true line, and the northern fields lay above it, and they were your father's. "And then?" Her voice came out lower than she meant. "And then it went up to the board," Julian said, "and it came back down, declared false. The boundary a fraud, the survey a forger's work. And by the spring the fields were seized and given over to Renfield to enlarge the estate, and your father was ruined." He drew a breath that caught. "But the survey that came back down was not the one I copied. The line had moved. Someone had redrawn it, here, higher, along the ridge, to take in the whole of the northern fields and set the boundary against your father's own house, and drawn it in a different ink. A blacker ink that had not aged as the rest of the sheet had aged, for it was newer by however many days it took to do the deed. I saw it. God forgive me. I was 22, and I saw it, and I thought of my post and my mother who I kept, and I told myself I had misremembered, and I said nothing. And I let them call your father a forger, for a line another hand had forged. The room was quiet. Below, faintly, someone was laying the great table for the feast that was 3 days off. She could hear the ring of silver being counted onto linen. "I kept the true one," Julian said. "The fair copy I made the Wednesday before ever it went up. I ought to have burned it. It would have hanged my peace to be found with it. But I could not, any more than I could speak. I have it still." He looked at her, and his open face was wet and unashamed of it. "I have carried it 10 years like a stone I could not swallow and could not spit out. I do not ask you to forgive the boy who stayed silent. I only tell you the map is a lie, and I can prove it. And I should have told you the day I first saw you kneel in this room and knew whose eyes you had." Della found that she had risen from her chair. She did not remember rising. She stood with her 2 hands spread on the false map, on the black redrawn line, and something in her that had been held clenched for 10 years and 3 began very slowly to open, not into weeping, for she was not made that way, but into a terrible clean clarity, as when the fog lifts off a coast and the whole treacherous shore stands suddenly plain. "Then it is all false," she said quietly. "Do you understand what you have given me, Mr. Ashby? Not merely that my father was wronged. The grant of the northern fields stands upon that survey. Every acre he built upon it, every plantation, every rent, every mortgage he raised against the land, the whole edifice of Renfield's greatness, It stands upon a boundary another hand drew after my father's was done, and a title raised upon a forged survey is no title. It conveys nothing. It never did. She lifted her eyes to his. The marriage settlement he means to sign at his feast conveys those very lands to Lady Cassandra's house as security for her fortune. He will sign away land he does not lawfully hold, and it cannot be sealed, it must not be sealed, without the keeper of the royal seal attesting that the titles are clean. Julian looked at her, uncomprehending. The keeper is some crown official. A clerk in London, they say, or an old man in the shires. No one knows, Della agreed, who the keeper is. She watched it reach him, watched his eyes go to her ink-stained hands, to the garnet ring, to the map, and back to her face, and she saw the whole of it arrive in him at once, the way light comes over a hill. You, he said. For 3 years, she said. The mark is in the wax of every honest grant in this county, Miss Ashby. Mine to make, and mine to withhold, and there is not a great man in it who has ever once looked at me and seen the hand that holds his legitimacy, including the one who calls me a forger's get across his own dinner table. She looked down at the false line, and her voice did not rise, and that was the most frightening thing about it. He has built his house on my father's stolen boundary, and then he trusted his titles to a keeper he could not name, and the keeper is the daughter of the man he ruined. 2 days later, Sir Reginald Pym's traveling coach came up the Renfield Drive in a fine October rain, and the Earl went out bareheaded to greet him on the steps, all warmth and open hands. My dear Sir Reginald, welcome, welcome, you honor the house. The herald let himself be greeted. He was a portly man and a courteous one, and he made his bows, and he said the proper things about the coming marriage, and the fine old hall, and the sad state of the roads, and not once did his bewhiskered face give anything away. But in the passage, an hour after, when the Earl had gone to dress, he found the cataloguer in the muniment room, and shut the door, and dropped the whole performance like a wet cloak. I have read your word, he said low, Ashby's tracing. If the boy will swear to it, and you will vouch the seal, then the founding grant is void and all that hangs from it with it. He studied her. You know what I must do then, before the settlement is sealed at the feast? The crown requires the keeper's own attestation that the titles are genuine, spoken aloud before witnesses, for a conveyance of this size touching a lady's fortune. I mean to require it. And you, Adelaide, you must be the one to answer. Not a paper sent up from the shires, you in that hall, before that company. There is no other way it stands in law. His old eyes were kind and quite immovable. It will cost you your quiet. Once you speak, you are the keeper before the world, and never again the plain woman in gray who sorts his boxes. Are you willing? I have been willing, she said, for 3 years. But the Earl was not a fool, whatever else he was, and a man does not build a false house without learning to feel a draught. Something in the herald's courtesy had been a shade too cool. Something in the way the examination had been spoken of had set his neck prickling. And so, the very next morning, he did the thing that Della, who had come to know the shape of his fears as a physician knows a fever, had half expected him to do. He had her turned out. There was no scene. There did not need to be one. Mrs. Pole came down to the muniment room with her mouth pressed white and her hands twisting in her apron, and said his lordship had no further need of the cataloguing, and the girl's wages were made up to the day, and she was to be gone from the house before the feast, for his lordship would not have thee. And here the old woman stopped, and could not say it, and said instead, harshly, that it was a wicked shame, and she'd say so to her Maker. The Earl himself did not trouble to come. But Julian was sent for, and Della, gathering her few things, heard through the door the cold voice telling the steward that if he valued his post he would see the forger's daughter escorted to the county line and would trouble himself no further with old maps and old lies, for the household would be questioned by the herald, and his lordship would not have it muddied by the presence of that name. So she let herself be dismissed. That was the art of it, to fall exactly as he wished her to fall, so that he might sleep easy the last night believing the trouble gone out of his house. She packed her single small trunk. She put on her gray wool and her plain bonnet. And into the false bottom of her father's map case, the long battered leather case he had carried across every field in the county, the smell of him still in the lining, she laid two things wrapped in oilcloth: Julian's 10-year tracing of the true boundary, and the small brass seal die, the keeper's own die, that made the 3-lined mark no other hand in England could make. She walked out through the great gates with her trunk on a hired boy's barrow and her father's case under her arm and her chin level, and let the grooms watch her go, and let the word run up to the house that the forger's daughter was gone down the road at last. And when she was past the lodge and out of sight of the windows, she stopped and gave the boy a coin, and turned not toward the county line but toward the village, where a widow she had paid took her in under the eaves, and she sent, by that same hired boy, a folded note to the Renfield stables to be put into Sir Reginald Pym's own hand and no other's, which said only, "I am at the sign of the Ram, in the village. I will come when I am called." That night, while Renfield Hall blazed to its chimneys with the candles being lit down all its length for the morrow's feast, while the Earl walked his radiant halls believing the last stone laid, the troublesome woman gone, his titles safe under a faceless keeper's distant stamp, Della sat at a plain deal table in a borrowed room under the eaves, a stub of candle burning, a little pot of red wax warming at its flame. She melted a bead of it onto a scrap of clean paper and let it cool the barest moment, and then she pressed her father's brass die firmly into it and lifted it away. And there in the wax lay the mark, 3 fine lines crossing at their secret angle, clean and true. She held it to the candle and turned it in the light, the way she had turned 1,000 seals, and found no fault in it. And she took the garnet ring from where it had sat turned inward against her palm all these long grinding months, and she turned it round, so that the small dark stone faced out at last, the way her father had worn it. And she looked at the little wax mark by the candlelight, and she was ready. The pen never touched the parchment. Sir Reginald Pym's hand closed over the Earl's wrist, gentle as a father steadying a child, and the whole high table went still. Edmund Harrow, Earl of Renfield, sat with the quill poised above the marriage settlement, its long feather trembling in the candlelight, and for a moment he did not understand. The hall was warm, with 200 candles and the breath of 100 guests. The smell of roast fowl and spiced wine and hot beeswax hung over the boards, and Lady Cassandra beside him had her fan half raised, her pretty face turned toward the herald in confusion. At the foot of the dais, her father, a lean, careful man who had made his fortune in wool and would spend a portion of it on a title, leaned forward with his glass halfway to his lips. "My lord," said Sir Reginald, and though his voice was mild it carried to the rafters, for he was a herald, and had spent his life being heard across crowded halls. "Before that seal is set, the crown requires a thing of you. No settlement conveying land in this county may be sealed until the keeper of the royal seal has attested that the titles conveyed are genuine and lawfully held. The Earl smiled. It was the smile he wore when a lesser man had made an error he might correct with grace, and he set the quill down along the edge of the parchment as if he were being patient. Sir Reginald, my papers are in order. Every grant, every charter, stamped and sealed by the keeper's own hand. You have seen them yourself these 3 days past. I have seen the seals, Sir Reginald agreed. That is precisely why the keeper must speak. A seal, my lord, is only worth the hand that set it, and the hand that set these is present tonight. A murmur went through the gentry like wind moving through barley. The Earl's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes shifted, some first small crack in the ice. The keeper is here? At my feast? The keeper was summoned, said the herald, under the king's authority. And the keeper has come. The great doors at the far end of the hall swung open on their iron hinges. She walked the whole length of the hall alone. There was no herald's trumpet, no announcement, only the long gray figure coming steadily up the aisle between the crowded tables. Plain gray wool, chestnut hair pinned severe, a battered map case under one arm, and her father's garnet ring turned outward now, so the red stone caught the candlelight with every step. The gentlemen who 3 days ago had laughed into their cups fell silent as she passed. She did not hurry. She had learned long ago that a woman who hurries invites men to think she is afraid, and Adelaide Marchbank was not afraid. She had spent 3 years being unafraid in rooms exactly like this one. The Earl came to his feet. "This is a jest," he said, and now the charm had gone thin over the anger beneath. This is my cataloguer. I dismissed her from my service not a week past. This is Marchbank's daughter, the forger's whelp, and if you have brought her here to make sport of my house—" "I brought no one," said Sir Reginald. "The crown summoned the keeper of the royal seal. She has answered." He rose too, and the 2 men stood at the high table, the old herald and the proud Earl, and between them the settlement lay waiting for a seal it would never receive. "My Lord of Renfield, I present to you Miss Adelaide Marchbank, appointed by His Majesty these 3 years to verify the authenticity of every land grant, title, and charter in this county, the faceless official whose mark you trusted. She is the keeper. She always was." Della had reached the foot of the dais. She set the map case down upon the edge of the high table, unhurried, and began to unbuckle its worn straps. "You may sit, my lord," she said quietly. "This will take a little while, and I would not have you tire." He did not sit, but he did not speak either, and in the silence she opened the case. "I will begin with your own charters," she said, "since you have offered them yourself as proof of your good title, and it is right that a man be answered with the very evidence he trusts." She drew out the first of them, the great grant of Renfield itself, thick vellum gone amber with age, its red wax seal the size of a man's palm depending from a plaited cord. She had signed for these from the muniment room's own shelves before she left. Sir Reginald had authorized their production for the examination, and Mrs. Pole, God bless her gruff and honest soul, had carried them down herself. Della held the seal up to the branch of candles nearest her and turned it so the light raked across the wax at an angle. "A seal has a face that any man may forge," she said, and her voice had steadied into the flat, precise cadence her father used to use over a survey table, the voice of someone reading truth off a surface. The impress of the die, the arms, the legend around the rim. A clever forger copies all of it. But there is a thing that cannot be copied by a man who does not know it is there, because he cannot see it unless the light is set just so. She tilted the wax another degree. Here along the lower left of the rim, beneath the 3rd quarter of the arms. a cartographer's north point, no larger than a grain of barley, pressed into the wax while it was soft by a second small die held in the left hand at the instant of sealing. My father designed it. I have set it into every seal I have authenticated in this county for 3 years, and there is not another soul living who knows how it is made, save Sir Reginald, who holds the record of it under the king's own lock. She passed the charter to the herald. He bent his portly frame over it, produced a jeweler's glass from his waistcoat, and studied the wax for a long moment while the hall held its breath. Then he straightened. "It is here," he said. "The keeper's mark. This charter is genuine, and genuinely sealed by her hand." "As are these," said Della, and she laid them out one after another down the length of the high table. The grant of the Eastern Water Meadows, the charter of the mill, the confirmation of the deer park, the mortgage lately raised against the whole to keep Renfield afloat until a wealthy bride could be found. Each bore her north point. Each she had, at some quiet hour in some muniment room, held to a candle and judged and marked as true. Every acre of Renfield that the Earl holds lawfully, he holds because I said so. The steward you scorned, the ink you said ran false in my blood, that ink has stood surety for your name in every court and counting house in the shire. You have lived 3 years inside my honesty, my lord, and never once suspected it." The Earl's face had gone the color of tallow. "Then you have proved my titles good," he said, snatching at it. "You have proved them clean by your own hand. Sir Reginald, she has done your office for you. Let the settlement be sealed." "I have proved," said Della, "that every seal you trust is mine. That is not the same as proving every grant beneath them is true." She reached back into the map case. "For there is one grant I have never marked, one founding parchment on which the whole of Renfield's greatness stands, and which no keeper's north point has ever touched, because it came into this house before ever I was appointed, and because it is false." She drew out 2 documents and laid them side by side upon the cleared center of the high table, where the settlement lay, and she turned them so that the great window behind the days stood beyond them, its autumn dusk gone deep blue, and the candle branches doubled in the black glass. "The survey of the northern fields," she said. "The instrument by which the lands of Thomas Marchbank were declared fraudulent and forfeit, and passed to Renfield to enlarge it." And beside it she set down the second, a thinner sheet, its lines fine and faded, the original tracing of that same survey, made in the surveyor's own office at the hour the work was done, before the fair copy was ever submitted to the court. Mr. Ashby, Julian Ashby, stepped out from the shadow of a pillar where he had been standing, and he came to the dais with his honest face pale but his shoulders square, and he did not once look at the Earl. "I made that tracing," he said, and though his voice shook at the first word, it did not shake at the last. "I was a young clerk in the surveyor's office the year the northern fields were taken. I traced the boundary as Thomas Marchbank set it, here, along the line of the old thorn hedge in the beck. And when the fair copy came back from the court declared false, I saw with my own eyes that the boundary had been redrawn. A single line moved south by half a mile to swallow the good meadow and the mill lead into the crown of the disputed ground, the very land that made the seizure worth the doing. I saw it. I was afraid. I said nothing, and a good man died of the shame of a lie I could have unmade with one word." He drew a breath. "I have carried the tracing sewn in my coat for 11 years. I swear before this company and before God that it is true, and that the survey that ruined Thomas Marchbank was altered after he submitted it." "You may all see it for yourselves," said Della. You need no herald's glass for this, only the light. She lifted both sheets and held them up together against the dark window, the tracing behind and the survey before, so the branch of candles shone through the two of them at once, and every line stood black against the glowing vellum. And there it was, plain to the whole hall, the boundary of the tracing running clean and true along one course, and the boundary of the survey diverging from it, dropping south in a long dishonest curve, the two lines parting company as clearly as a road that forks. And the ink of that divergence, Della said, tilting the sheet so the candlelight caught the surface, was not the ink of the rest. Look how it lies differently on the vellum. A shade browner, a shade glossier, laid down by another pen on another day. The whole survey is written in oak gall ink, mixed with the surveyor's own hand. This one line is not. It is the addition of a forger. The word fell into the hall like a stone into a well. You accused me of that trick, my lord, said Della, and for the first time she turned and looked full at the Earl of Renfield, and her gray eyes did not blink. At this very table, before these very gentlemen, 3 days past you held a map to the light and said the ink ran false in my blood. That ink can be made to lie. You were right that ink can lie. You knew it better than any man here, for you paid to have it lie once already. A line redrawn in a different ink to steal a dead man's fields and call the dead man a fraud. Every accusation you flung at me was a confession of what you had done yourself. Lady Cassandra's father had risen from his seat. Sir Reginald, he said, and his wool merchant's voice was hard and level, is this proven, or is this a woman's tale? It is proven, said the herald. He had taken up the 2 sheets himself and laid them again against the window, and he studied the parting of the lines a long while, and the different lie of the ink with his glass. Then he set them down. The alteration is plain, and there is more, sir, that touches your own interest most nearly. He turned to the hall at large now, and his herald's voice rose to fill it corner to corner. The founding grant of the northern fields is forged. That land was never lawfully Renfield's to hold. And because it was not, because that grant is false at the root, every grant that grew from it is void. The mortgage raised against those acres, void. And this, he laid one broad hand flat upon the marriage settlement. This settlement, which conveys those very northern fields and the mill leat and the good meadow to Lady Cassandra's family as the substance of the bride's security, conveys land the Earl of Renfield does not own. I cannot, in the Crown's name, permit its sealing. The keeper cannot attest to titles that are false, and I will not. He took up the settlement in both hands, and in the sight of the whole company he turned it face down upon the board. By the authority vested in me as the king's herald and examiner of titles, said Sir Reginald Pym, I void this settlement, and I order the survey of the northern fields struck from the record as a forgery. The seizure it enabled reversed, and the northern fields, the mill leat, the good meadow, and all that was taken under it, restored to the name and heirs of Thomas Marchbank, cartographer, whose honest work was made to bear a lie. For a moment no one moved. Then Lady Cassandra's father set down his glass, and he did not shout, for men who have earned their own money rarely shout. He simply turned to his daughter and said, Cassandra, fetch your cloak. We are leaving. And to the Earl he said, there will be no marriage, my lord. My girl's fortune was to buy a title with clean land beneath it, and you have offered her a title with a theft beneath it and a debt on top. I'll not have my daughter's dowry propping up a forger. Good night to you. He bowed precisely and without warmth to Sir Reginald and to Della both, madam, And he took his bewildered daughter by the arm and led her from the hall. And a good third of the gentry rose and gathered their wives and followed, because the tide had turned, and everyone in the room could feel which way the water ran. The Earl of Renfield stood alone at his high table. He looked down the emptying hall, at the guests slipping toward the doors, at the settlement lying face down, at the 2 sheets of vellum still glowing faintly where a footman had set them near the candles. The silver at his temples caught the light. He had believed birth was destiny. He had believed a man born to a great name could never truly fall, that the world was arranged to catch such men before they struck the ground. And the world was indeed arranged to catch them, but only so long as the papers held, and the papers had been hers. "You were nothing," he said to Della, low, and it was not quite a threat and not quite a plea, only the last words of a man watching his own foundation dissolve. A cataloguer, a clerk's ruined daughter in gray wool. "I was the keeper of the royal seal," said Della. "I was that when I catalogued your papers, and when you called my father a fraud across your own dinner, and when you put me out your gate with 1 trunk. I did not become anything tonight, my lord. I only stopped being invisible." She began, calmly, to gather her charters and roll them and slide them back into her father's map case. "You had 3 years in which any kindness to me would have cost you nothing, and might have earned you a friend at the one desk in this county that could ruin you. You chose to be cruel to a woman you thought was no one. That was not my doing. That was only ever yours." Sir Reginald had sent word to the sheriff. Before ever he sat down to the feast, 2 of the king's men were already at the door. They did not lay hands on the Earl. One did not on a peer, not yet. Not until the courts had done their slow work. But they walked him from his own hall with quiet inevitability, out past the guttering candles and the abandoned trenchers and the long tables where 200 guests had gathered to see him wed, and the doors closed behind him, and the great hall of Renfield was still. Mrs. Pole found Della a while later, near the cold hearth, and pressed her rough old hand once, hard, and said only your father would be that proud. And Della found she could not answer, and the housekeeper understood and left her to it. It was Julian who came last, when the servants had carried off the candles by the branchful, and only a few were left burning down the long boards, and the hall had gone dim and vast and quiet as a church after the singing has stopped. He stopped a little way off, hat in his hands, not presuming. "I should have spoken 11 years ago," he said. "The night I traced that boundary and saw it changed. I told myself I had a post to keep and a way to make, and that one clerk's word would only be crushed and change nothing. But it would have changed everything. It would have changed," his voice caught. "It would have changed you and me, Della, and I have known that every day since, and it has been the whole shape of my cowardice." "It would have," she agreed. She did not soften it. She was not a woman who softened true things, and he loved her the more for it, standing there. But she came toward him across the flagstones, her boots quiet on the stone, the map case under her arm and her father's ring warm now against her finger. The boy who stayed silent, I cannot pretend he did no harm. He did. My father died inside that silence. She stopped before him. But the man who kept the tracing 11 years, sewn in his coat, waiting, the man who stepped out from behind that pillar tonight in front of every gentleman in the shire and swore to it though it cost him his place and might have cost him more, that man I can forgive. That man I would be glad to know. You were a coward once, Julian. You were not a coward tonight. A person is allowed to become the second thing. He looked at her as though she had handed him back something he had buried long ago and stopped hoping to see. The northern fields, he said, are yours now. The Marchbank land, the good meadow and the mill leat and the old thorn hedge along the beck, all of it, back in your father's name and yours. There's a house on the good meadow, said Della. Or there was. Half tumbled now, I should think, after 11 years untenanted. She looked toward the dark window where the 2 vellum sheets still lay, the honest one and the false, and past them to where, miles off in the autumn night, a stretch of quiet fields she had not stood upon since she was a girl waited under the same stars. It could be made warm again. It would want work, a steady hand for the accounts and the boundaries and the setting of it right. The smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first anyone at Renfield had seen there in all her months of gray silence. I am told there is a man of law lately without a situation who knows this land better than any other, and traces a very honest line. There is, said Julian, and his voice was not steady at all now, and neither of them minded. There is such a man, if she would have him. She would, said Adelaide Marchbank. In time and properly, with the banns read and her father's name cleared first before all the county. But she would. There was a stub of candles still burning on the nearest board, the last of the 200, its flame guttering low in a little pool of its own wax. Della reached out, and with the ink-stained fingers she had never quite scrubbed clean and no longer cared to, she trimmed the wick with her nails so that it caught again and stood up straight and bright. She did not blow it out this time. She let it burn. Outside, the autumn wind moved over the northern fields that were hers again, over the good meadow and the old thorn hedge, and the beck running dark to the mill, over her father's honest boundary come home at last. And inside, in the great emptied hall where a proud man had called her a forger, and every seal in the room had turned out to be her own, Della stood beside Julian in the small warm light, unhurried, and let herself, for the first time in 11 years, simply be glad.